Julius Caesar stood looking out across the sea, towards the island in the distance. Behind him were the lands of Gaul, now at the mercy of Roman might. Would this island receive the same fate? However, Caesar had also learnt the ancient ancestry of the Britons. Long ago, their civilization had been founded by Brutus of Troy, who was descended from the great Aeneas. Likewise, Romulus, the founder of Rome, was also a descendant of Aeneas. So perhaps due to their shared Trojan heritage, war between the Romans and the Britons would be unnecessary. He therefore sent an envoy to the Britons, requesting that they pay tribute to Rome. Not long later, he received a response from King Cassibelanus of the Britons. He rejected Rome's request, stating that the Britons were a free people, and that they would not be paying tribute to anyone. Rome's demands were an insult to their shared ancestry, and if Caesar wished to attack Britain, he would find them ready to defend their country and their freedoms. Upon hearing this, Caesar prepared his army and set sail for Britain, intent on conquest. The winds were good, and the Romans followed the coast round into the River Thames, where they landed and made camp. Soon after, Cassibelanus arrived with his army, ready to face the Romans. Cassibelanus was also accompanied by his brother Mennius and his nephew Androgeus. They had a brief discussion and decided to launch an immediate assault upon the Romans, in order to prevent them from getting more time to prepare. Therefore they attacked, and a large battle took place, with intense fighting on both sides. Much blood was spilled, and it was said the ground of the battlefield was filled with the bodies of thousands of fallen men. Amidst the fighting, Mennius, along with Androgeus and a company of Britons, managed to breach the ranks of the Romans, and found themselves face to face with the bodyguards of Caesar himself. As Androgeus and the men kept the guards busy, Mennius slipped through, intending to face Caesar head-on. Mennius rushed forward, slashing his sword at Caesar. However, it met the Roman's shield. Then Caesar swung his own sword forwards, and it crashed against Mennius' helmet. Mennius stumbled back from the strike, and Caesar raised his sword once more to deliver the finishing blow. However, Mennius managed to raise his own shield in time. It was such a fierce strike against the shield bow that Caesar's blade became lodged in it and came out of his grip. At this moment, several of Caesar's bodyguards rushed in and came between him and the Briton. Likewise, a couple of Britons ran forward and pulled the wounded Mennius away from the fight. Once among his own men, Mennius, while still bleeding, pulled Caesar's blade from his shield. Wielding it, he rushed against the enemy, slaying many, including one of Caesar's lieutenants, Labienus. As the day wore on, the Britons gained ground against the Romans and eventually drove them back towards the river banks where their ships were. Realizing he had been defeated, Caesar called off the invasion, and the Romans retreated back to their ships. They set sail, leaving Britain behind and returning to Gaul. Cassibelanus was delighted with his victory. However, that joy quickly turned to anguish. Amongst the dead was the body of his brother, Mennius. The man had eventually succumbed to the wound that Caesar had dealt, and he died on the battlefield. Later, Mennius would be buried in London, along with Caesar's sword. When Caesar landed back in Gaul, the Gauls heard of his defeat, and believing that he was now weak, they rebelled against him. Caesar would eventually put down the revolt, but the defeat at the hands of the Britons still weighed heavily on his mind. 2 years after his original expedition, he once again set sail with the intent of conquering the Britons. During this time, Cassibelanus had also been busy. Expecting the Romans to return, he garrisoned his cities and repaired walls where they were broken. In the River Thames, where Caesar had attacked last time, he planted great stakes below the surface, ready for any Roman ships. Caesar did attempt to land via the Thames again. This time, his ships crashed against the new stakes. The ships sank, and many Romans would drown in the river. With his remaining ships, he made a landing. However, the Britons were ready for this. Led by Cassibelanus, they charged down upon the disorganized Roman forces, which were scattered on the beach. The battle was decisive, and the Britons were victorious. Seeing that he would not be successful, Caesar called off the expedition and returned to Gaul. Cassibelanus had defeated the Romans for a second time. Grand celebrations were held in London, which all the nobles of the realm travelled to attend. It was a good time for all, as feasts took place and sacrifices were made to the gods. It was during these celebrations, though, that an event occurred which would be the king's undoing. During the partying, a fight broke out between the king's nephew, Hieroglas, and the nephew of Duke Androgeus, called Evelyn. Initially they just insulted each other, but then in a fit of rage, Evelyn drew his sword and struck Hieroglas' head off. When Cassibelanus got word of this, he was furious and deeply upset about the death of his nephew. He demanded that Androgeus bring Evelyn before him to face trial. Androgeus refused, and said that Evelyn would face trial in his own court, and not the court of the king. Cassibelanus was outraged by this, and threatened Androgeus with war if he did not hand Evelyn over. When Androgeus heard of this, he sent a letter to Caesar. In the letter, he claimed Evelyn was innocent, and that he had slain Hieroglas accidentally. He said the king refused to listen to reason, and so he was calling upon Caesar to aid him. When Caesar received the letter, he discussed it with his generals, but advised him not to go simply on the duke's request, but instead to demand hostages first. Androgeus accepted the demand for hostages, sending his son to Gaul, along with 30 youths from amongst the children of his vassals. With the hostages in place, Caesar set sail, and this time landed in the village of Rutipai, rather than attempting the River Thames again. Meanwhile, Androgeus had moved quickly and occupied London with his army. In response, Casablanus gathered his own forces and laid siege to the city. However, when he learned that Caesar had landed, the king abandoned the siege and marched to face him. His scouts spotted the Romans making camp and reported back. Casablanus, hoping to take the Romans by surprise, ordered his men to march quickly and attack them. Unfortunately, the Romans also had scouts and became aware of the army of Britons approaching. They managed to form ranks just in time and were able to resist the initial charge of the Britons. The fighting became fierce, with major losses being taken on both sides, but to the west another army was approaching. Androgeus had left London with 5,000 men and came upon the rear of the king's army. Being attacked from both sides, the Britons broke ranks and fled. Casablanus gathered around him what men he could and made a dash to a nearby hill, which was more defensible. The Romans and rebel Britons pursued and slew many of them as they ran. Once they reached the hill, the king turned around and made a stand with his surviving men. There they slew many of their attackers, using skirmishing tactics to slow the Romans as they climbed the hill. The terrain was rocky and steep, and the Romans struggled to make any progress against the Britons. Instead, Caesar surrounded the hill, blocking off all routes of escape for the Britons. Unprepared for the siege, the Britons on the hill had no food, and Caesar knew this. After 2 days of waiting, Casablanus knew no help was coming, and sent a messenger to Androgeus requesting priests. Androgeus then went to Caesar and asked him to have mercy upon the Britons. Caesar accepted, and eventually a deal was struck, where Casablanus would pay tribute to Rome annually. In the weeks following the end of this conflict, Caesar would stay in Britain for the winter, and during this time, he and Casablanus ended up becoming friends. When the spring came, they exchanged gifts, and Caesar travelled to Gaul, where he would gather an army to march from Rome itself. When he left, Androgeus travelled with him, eager to see the sights of the empire. Julius Caesar would never return to Britain. Casablanus would rule for 7 more years before dying. Then the throne would pass to the brother of Androgeus, Tenuantius. When Tenuantius died, it passed to his son, Cymbeline. Cymbeline had been raised by the court of Augustus Caesar in Rome, and so the Britons had good relations with the Romans during his reign. He had 2 sons, Guiderius and Aviricus, and when he died, Guiderius became king. Unlike his father, Guiderius disliked the Romans and refused to pay the annual tribute that had been in place since the days of Casablanus. This angered the Roman Emperor Claudius, and he decided to invade the island along with his commander-in-chief, Levis Hamo. Hamo was a Roman who had lived among the Britons for many years and was fluent in their language. The Romans crossed the channel, landing near the city of Caepirus, which they then laid siege to. Upon news of the Romans' arrival, Guiderius gathered an army and marched to meet them. When they arrived, the Britons attacked immediately, with Guiderius leading the charge. It went decisively in their favour, and soon the Romans were being pushed back. Seeing this happen, Hamo ditched his Roman armour and took on the guise of a Briton. He infiltrated their ranks, and slowly but surely made his way closer to King Guiderius. As he moved, he spoke in the language of the Britons, cheering them on towards victory. However, once he found an opening, he moved forward and struck the king with his sword, before swiftly slipping away into the confused crowds. Hamo then escaped the clutches of the Briton and returned to the side of the Romans. Guiderius died soon after from his wounds, but the soldiers were unaware of this, and so continued to fight on. Eventually the Britons triumphed, and the Roman army was routed. Half of them retreated to the ships of Claudius, whilst Hamo and his men were cut off and forced to hide in the forests. Discovering his brother's death, Aviricus immediately proclaimed himself king, and took command of the army. His first act was to follow the Romans into the forest, where he hunted them down and slew Hamo. Claudius wasted no time gathering his forces, and soon led a second assault on Paris, whilst the army of the Britons was distracted. Taken off guard, the city soon fell to him. Aviricus returned with his men, and was preparing an assault on the gates of the city. Claudius sent a messenger to him. In the message, Claudius said he was greatly impressed by the valour of the Britons, and he wished to make peace with them. He offered his daughter in marriage to Aviricus, if he would acknowledge the kingdom of Britain to be a fief of the Roman Empire. Aviricus discussed this with the nobles of the land. They knew that more Roman legions would be on the way if they refused. They didn't consider it a disgrace to become a vassal of Rome, which now seemed to rule all the world. Therefore, they decided to accept the offer. Claudius stayed in Britain until his daughter arrived in the spring of the following year. She was called Genuessa, and she was extremely beautiful. It was said the marriage between her and Aviricus was a happy one. During this time, a new city was founded at the place where the couple were wedded. The city was named in honour of the emperor and was called Caeglu. After this, Claudius returned to Rome, and there was peace for several years. The realm prospered under the rule of Aviricus. However, his pride also grew, and he began to despise the power of the Romans over him. He declared himself free of Rome. When Claudius got word of this, he sent his general, Vespasian, to either reconcile or subjugate the Britons. Vespasian set sail for Rutepi, with an army of Romans, but when he arrived there, he found Aviricus waiting for him with a vast army of Britons. Knowing he would have no hope of landing there, he changed his course and made for Totnes. There he made land, marched his men upon Caerhugliot, and laid siege to the town. After 7 days, the armies of Aviricus arrived, and a battle took place. Both sides took many losses, but the battle was indecisive. The following morning, Queen Genuessa managed to persuade her husband to broker a peace. After some negotiations, the status quo was restored, and Vespasian returned to Rome. In the following years, Abragas, now growing in age, began to have a higher regard for Rome again, and slowly the relationship between the two peoples began to improve once more. When Abragas eventually passed away, he was buried in Gloucester, and his son Marius took the throne. During the reign of Marius, a number of ships arrived on the coast of Albany, carrying people known as the Picts, led by their king, Roderick. Having travelled all the way from Scythia, they now began to raid and attack the lands of the Britons. Marius gathered an army and marched north to meet them. There he won several battles, and in the final one, Roderick was slain. He was victorious, but he now had to decide what to do with these people. After some discussions, it was decided that they would be allowed to settle in the mountainous lands of northern Albany, as that was sparsely populated at the time. The Picts did exactly that. There they would marry women from Ireland in large numbers, and their population would greatly multiply. Marius would rule in peace for the rest of his life, and after his death, the crown would pass to his son Coel. Coel would be raised in Rome, and had been taught the ways of the Romans, and he would bring many of their customs over to Britain. After him, the throne passed to his son, Lucius. During his reign, a missionary arrived from the court of Pope Eleutherius, who was preaching the good news of Christianity. Lucius decided to convert, and soon much of the realm followed in his footsteps. Temples were rededicated away from the pagan gods to Christ, and thousands were baptized. Priests were ordained, and bishops were established in many of the major towns and cities. With its vassalage to Rome and its conversion to Christianity, Britain had entered a new era, and that is where we shall end for today. Next time, we will cover what happened in the later years of Roman Britain. Until then, farewell.